Hello, everyone. I want to thank you all for joining us today for this discussion on a new report co-published by the Nuclear Information Service and Nukewatch concerning the UK's planned procurement of dual-capable F-35A fighter jets. My name is Okopi Ajonye, and I'm a researcher with the Nuclear Information Service, which is a research organization that investigates and consolidates information about the UK's nuclear weapon system. I should also note that this year actually marks the 25th year and 25th anniversary of our founding. And we are proud to be continuing to promote work that promotes transparency as well as accountability concerning the UK's nuclear weapons program. And our part co-publishers at Nukewatch track and monitor movements of the UK's nuclear weapons system. And together, our two organizations, along with some who are actually included among the attendees today, aim to strengthen public awareness as well as inform debates around nuclear weapons policy in the UK. We're very pleased to be joined by a distinguished panel of experts from a range of organizations and backgrounds, who also share the same commitment as us to open and informed discussion about these critical issues. I also want to note that today's session is being recorded and it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel after this discussion. We'd also like to ask the attendees to keep their microphones and cameras off during the presentation. Also, to share any questions that they may have in the chat or address them directly through the audio and video. And with that said, I'm delighted to hand over to our moderator, Paul Rogers, who will provide a more detailed introduction of the topic as well as our panelists.
Thank you very much indeed, and welcome to everybody. And we hope this will be a very informative session. Had a lot of interest in it very recently because of what's happening on the scene. Let me just introduce our other panelists so that we know exactly where we go. Peter Burt will be the first person, and each of the panelists is being asked to talk for about 10 minutes. Pete, I'm sure, is known to many of you. He has worked with nuclear information systems in the past. He is very well known for producing really detailed reports, well written, but the key thing is really well researched. And it's so important in this field to have that. And I'm delighted that he was actually the author of this particular report. We've got from across the Atlantic, Eliana Johns. I would put it this way, she works obviously for the Federation of American Scientists, but more or less anybody in the field anywhere around the world would look to FAS and particularly its nuclear notebooks for information on what's happening in the nuclear field. And Eliana is very much involved in that. She has a particular interest, I think, in the nuclear notebooks, which are very well known as sources. She's a co-editor of that. And she also actually has an interest in Korean nuclear things and has worked a lot on that. And I think she does actually have a knowledge of Korean itself, which I'm in awe of anybody who can do that. And then, of course, we have Nick Ritchie. Professor Nick Ritchie is Professor of International Security at the University of York. Just earlier on, we were talking among ourselves, and I said I first met Nick when he was a final year student in peace studies at Bradford, researching nuclear proliferation. So it's hugely appropriate that he's going to be with us today. We're going to try and stick to time reasonably well. In fact, I'll finish inside my 7 or 8 minutes quite shortly, and then there will be time for questions and discussion afterwards. When I heard that this report was coming out, I thought it's immensely timely, but it also is part of a long history. Many people who are concerned about the British nuclear program will be concerned about Trident replacement, all the problems with the Trident program and the rest, the cost and everything else. But if you go back into more distant times, Britain was a proportionally bigger player at one time, and people tend to forget that, to put it bluntly, we had nuclear weapons all over the place. We certainly had them based at Akrotiri and Cyprus for a while. There was a period back in the 1960s when Britain's 4 fleet aircraft carriers each carried nuclear-capable planes, either the Scimitar or the Kinnear. And of course, later on, we had a range of ways of delivering nuclear weapons, sometimes in conjunction with Americans. So we had the Lance missile in Germany. We had 2 classes of artillery piece, all 3 of them nuclear armed, using nuclear weapons under a dual key system. We had, I think it was, I'm right in saying we had British nuclear weapons for use on the Sea Harrier plane. And there's plenty of evidence that the Sea Harriers were actually active in the Falklands War on warships which were actually carrying tactical nuclear weapons at the time. That was something which caused huge controversy in Whitehall, but it's a period when, you know, we got closer to things than we ever realized at the time. And then, of course, there was Polaris and its successors. So overall, Britain has been thoroughly involved in the field. And I think one has to recognize that this is a continuing thing within the British military. I think particularly within the Navy at present, things nuclear loom larger than they do, I think, in ordinary life, or indeed the other two branches of the armed forces. So that, I think, is a very good reason for looking at this, because apart from anything else, the new system is going to be used as an air-delivered system by the RAF for the first time in, what's it, 2 or 3 decades. I'm sure Peter can be precise on that. So we're in a time of change. We're in a time of expansion. The one other thing I would note is that just a few years ago, there was a move by successive governments, and held certainly by the current Labour government, appallingly, of two things. One is to say as little as possible about the size and any expansion of the British nuclear programme, and secondly, to be even more secret than had been the case in the past. There'd been some degree of openness until a few years ago. That has more or less closed up. And this, in my opinion, is why nuclear information services is so important. As a very well-informed NGO, run with very little money, so anybody got spare money, you know where to send it. But really, it's been a sort of an underpinning of realistic studies of what is actually available, and has pushed the whole pendulum, if you like, in one direction to more openness when it's really swinging in the other direction. For that reason alone, I think it's very well worth having, and congratulations to it, to the work it does. But with those few opening remarks, let's go straight into this. So firstly, I'm really pleased to call on Peter Burt to give us the sense of this research paper, how it fits in and why it's important. So Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul, and hello everybody. I'm Peter Burt. I'm from Nukewatch UK. Nukewatch UK tracks the movements and deployments of UK nuclear weapons, and we are the only non-government way of validating the status of the UK's nuclear weapons programme and whether government statements on that programme are true. So I'm just going to explain why we wrote this report and talk about some of the issues arising from what was a carefully staged, managed announcement from the government before the NATO summit in June this year. The focus on news reporting and discussion about this topic has been on nuclear-capable F-35A aircraft purchases, but it's really not the aircraft or the bombs or the bases which are significant. The issue is much bigger than that. What we're talking about are plans for the whole-scale re-nuclearization of the Royal Air Force, turning a whole branch of the UK Armed Forces into a nuclear enterprise, which is a very complicated and expensive task. And those of us who are campaigners need to think of it as such and present it in that light. And I'm going to be arguing that the government has severely underestimated the scale of that task and the risks and the implications of their decision. And on the basis of what is public knowledge so far, plans for re-nuclearizing the Air Force, for bringing back a nuclear capability that was abandoned with a great fanfare 30 years ago, those plans lack credibility and are unlikely to be feasible under the terms which have currently been set out by ministers. So let's cast our minds back to June this year, when the announcement to buy new nuclear-capable F-35A Lightning II jet aircraft was made at the time of the NATO summit. And the UK government announced that it intended to purchase 12 F-35A aircraft and join what is called NATO's Dual Capable Aircraft Nuclear Mission, which is an arrangement where European air forces are equipped to use American nuclear bombs. And the government described this move as the biggest strengthening of the UK's nuclear posture in a generation. Now, the timing of this announcement was important. It was immediately before the NATO summit, and clearly there was a lot of politics involved in the announcement. The way I look at it is that the UK has been trying to bolster political solidarity within the NATO alliance to show President Trump that NATO's European members are willing to contribute to NATO in a way that he wants to see. But this announcement had been trailed heavily in the weeks beforehand, led by a front page article in the Sunday Times just before publication of the Strategic Defence Review. And the article suggested that the move was a recommendation from the review. In fact, the review actually had virtually nothing to say about nuclear-armed aircraft, and its authors have since distanced themselves very much from the proposal, particularly when giving evidence to the Defence Committee in Parliament. And the lead author of the review, Lord Robertson, has gone as far as saying, "We weren't terribly enthusiastic about the idea." So this proposal seems to have had its origins within the nuclear lobby in the Ministry of Defence and government, but have been presented to the public through a carefully staged media campaign. And I think one reason for this is to downplay the complexity and the controversy of this proposal and try to manufacture the view that there is really a consensus behind this idea. Oh, it's just a matter of buying a few aircrafts and borrowing some bombs from the Americans. So who could object to that? In fact, there is far more to it than that, as Nick will explain. So very little detail was given in the government announcement, but even to non-experts, there are obviously some really big questions about the proposal. So firstly, the B-61 nuclear bombs carried by these aircraft are held by US armed forces. So the operation is entirely under US control. Now, if you're worried that the US isn't going to come to Europe's help in a crisis, that's a bit of a limitation. Secondly, the Royal Air Force currently only plans to buy 12 F-35A aircraft, and this is far below the number needed for any credible nuclear force, particularly when you consider that the F-35 aircraft has issues with its operational reliability. And then there is the question of when the aircraft will actually be available. And even by the most opportunistic, the most optimistic estimates, they're not going to be in service before the end of the decade at the very earliest. And rather bizarrely, the Air Force plans to use these F-35 aircraft. Primarily, their main role is going to be training new pilots to learn how to fly its whole fleet of F-35 aircraft. So what does this actually mean for its nuclear role? If these aircraft are going to be used as general trainers, then how can they also be available for nuclear readiness or nuclear specific training and exercises? So hopefully you're already getting the flavour of an idea maybe that hasn't been fully thought through, and that if the government are serious about renuclearizing the Royal Air Force, then it's going to take a long time and need a lot more aircraft and money than has been discussed so far. And there are several reasons why this is a bad idea. Firstly, there's no military logic or need behind the decision for the UK to join the UK nuclear mission, because other European NATO members have been perfectly able to deliver the role for themselves for decades already without the UK. The UK already contributes to NATO's nuclear role via UK Trident. It's also very, very much against international non-proliferation initiatives. The government made a big fuss internationally at the end of the 1990s when it abandoned the RAF's original nuclear capability. And this new proposal also directly contravenes agreements on extending the terms of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which the UK played a big role in negotiating back in 2000, and which the Foreign Office still boasts about the part it played in achieving that agreement. The agreement, which is known as the 13 Steps, commit states to irreversibility in its disarmament measures. So once you've done it, you can't go back. But that's exactly what the UK are doing when it comes to re-nuclearizing the Air Force. And most important of all, of course, these so-called tactical nuclear weapons of the type which are planned for the Royal Air Force pose significant risks of dangerous nuclear escalation in wartime, which puts UK citizens at even greater risk during a crisis. So we have a proposal really that has all the hallmarks of having been pulled together in a hurry without any thought about its practicalities or its consequences. And I see it as largely just political smoke and mirrors to deceive the public and politicians from other NATO countries into thinking that the UK is taking a significant step to strengthen its nuclear forces, when in reality it's not. This is all politics. It's driven by internal NATO politics rather than any military need. The architects of this plan, Starmer, Healey, they won't be around to deliver on it. They will be long gone by the time any practical steps have to be taken on delivering this capability. It will either be quietly forgotten or become a massive headache for the next government. So if you want to know more about that, then please read the report. The link is in the chat. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions, so do please put your questions in the question and answer panel, and thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much, Peter. That's a really good introduction. I might say I was able to read the report, in fact, just a few days ago as it happened. And it's an absolute mine of information, really very useful in many different respects and pretty complicated. I think you did a brilliant summary. You picked out the main points. What I would say is that anybody who's sort of a serious campaigner on nuclear weapons, it's worth getting the report and taking a bit of time to read it. It's comprised of short chapters, very clear, fully referenced, and really pointing out the political issues that are arising, which we'll come back to, I think, particularly with Nick in a few moments. But what we should do now is move on now to listen to Eliana. We're very pleased to welcome you, and you, I hope, can present us with something of a US view and how it's viewed from the US, looking at us from the outside. Over to you, Eliana.
Thank you so much. I think I'll say first off, just thank you to the folks at the Nuclear Information Service and Nukewatch for having me today. I'll just say, so at FAS, my team, as mentioned, develops estimates for the number of nuclear weapons in the world, and we track the trends, modernization programs, doctrine of all the 9 nuclear armed states. And we've recently done some work looking at the United Kingdom, specifically around the return of the US Air Force nuclear mission to Lakenheath. And we have a publication coming out hopefully this week, our next nuclear notebook series, which will be on nuclear weapons in Europe as well. So if you're interested in more of that perspective, feel free to take a look. So today I'll really be zooming out to talk a little bit about the greater context that we're seeing in Europe, and maybe why some of these changes are taking place in that greater perspective. So currently, there are an estimated 100 to 120 US B-61-12 gravity bombs, or B-61 bombs in Europe, which are stored at 6 bases in 5 NATO countries. Of course, that number might be shifting here soon. And this arrangement is such that dual-capable aircraft from these and a few other countries are equipped and certified to deliver these US weapons. And today, after decades of reductions and consolidation, we're seeing the role and presence of nuclear weapons in Europe increase. And when we look at nuclear rhetoric, operations, and infrastructure across these bases in Europe, there have been a lot of changes in the past decade, especially since Russia annexed Crimea in 2014 and, of course, invaded Ukraine in 2022. Some of the things that we're seeing here The F-35s are starting to replace legacy dual-capable aircraft in the nuclear strike role. And of course, the B-61-12 guided nuclear bomb has now replaced the legacy B-61 bombs that were previously deployed. And I'll go a little bit into detail on the B-61. So the US had completed production of this weapon in 2024, late 2024, and it's now deployed to these bases across Europe and integrated on US and allied dual-capable aircraft. So the B-61-12 is the United States' first guided standoff nuclear gravity bomb. It uses a modified version of an old warhead, the B-61-4, which had an approximate maximum yield of 50 kilotons with several lower yield options, which gives you a little bit of an idea of what that looks like. And the B-61-12 is actually equipped with what's called a guided tail kit, which will only work really on the F-35s. There are options for use on other DCA, but this new weapon will increase accuracy and standoff capabilities and then allow for lower yields to reduce collateral damage. That's the idea behind this new system. So between the F-35s and the B-61s, these systems require really extensive upgrades to the bases that store US nuclear weapons across Europe. You'll need security upgrades to comply with new US Air Force safety standards, which this is something that has been going on for a little while now. But we're also seeing, new facilities, service areas, tarmacs for these bases to receive the F-35s. You'll also have upgrades to the underground weapons storage vaults, new command and control, and like the cabling will have to be replaced or upgraded, and loading pads for C-17 transport. There's really a lot going on, and this is something that we can track on satellite imagery. You can see it through budget documents. And in addition to these infrastructure changes, there are also changes in increased rhetoric and signaling. So we've seen enhanced visibility of NATO's annual tactical nuclear exercise, Steadfast Noon. We've seen increased strategic bomber operations. Strategic missile submarines are making port visits or surfacing for photo opportunities. And of course, too, when we zoom out a little bit further, you have France, which has bolstered its nuclear rhetoric and announced plans to establish another nuclear airbase in eastern France. So given all of these, really, really major changes that have been growing over the past decade or so and really accelerated in recent years, we look at Lakenheath and Marham as the latest in the series of these modernizations, some of the modernizations which did begin before Russia's first invasion of Ukraine, but again, in 2014, but again, were really accelerated in the past couple of years. So just, at Lakenheath, you have the return of the U.S. Air Force mission for the first time in nearly 20 years, which is a major change. And now we have Marham, which is only some 30 kilometers north of Lakenheath, I believe, which will host the 12 F-35s and likely US B-61-12 bombs that are assigned to those aircraft. And as I've kind of implied through some of these other infrastructure upgrades, Marham has a long, long way to go before it has the necessary facilities and command and control upgrades that it will need to support this mission. So you have specialized tarmacs, updated protective aircraft shelters, and as also was mentioned, the mission likely won't even be operational until the early 2030s. So this is it's a serious shift for the United Kingdom to reestablish an air-based nuclear capability in order to provide this full spectrum escalation management. And we've seen some other changes recently in the UK as well, in response, to this evolving security environment. The 2021 Integrated Defense Review announced a reversal of decades of gradual disarmament policies, as well as an increase in the upper limit of its nuclear inventory. So it went from no more than 225 warheads to up to no more than 260 warheads. And the government also announced that it will no longer publish transparency information, which again is a really key issue here that was mentioned. And all of these things are worrying trends that will make the work that we do much more difficult because of this decrease in openness. But of course, that means this work is all the more important. And it's great to have so many folks who are looking at this issue. So I hope this provided a little bit of background for just the environment and the context in which these changes are taking place. And I really look forward to a great conversation. So thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Eliana. Perhaps I could just add one thing before we move on to Nick. And it's something which you said, which I think has a greater significance than people may realize. That was when you're describing the bomb with its guided capability and its range of yields. So technically speaking, it could be more accurate. Therefore, a small yielding weapon can do the same job. And as you said, decrease collateral damage. I think one of the ways of also saying that is that it is a more usable weapon from a military point of view. About 35 years ago, when things were easing up after the INF Treaty had come in, NATO used to do sort of guided tours for different groups of people in Britain, looking at their facilities, particularly when nuclear weapons was still a big issue. And I remember they actually got some peace activists to go over, which I think was very interesting for them. I couldn't go on that meeting. I'd hoped to, but I was asked to go just a few months later, and I ended up with a team of actually church people of one sort or another, about sort of 12 or 15 of us who were given the kind of briefing. On one occasion, we had a mooring talking about NATO nuclear weapons, and they didn't disguise the fact that NATO did have a first use policy. And I got talking over coffee to a German civil servant who was actually a member of the nuclear planning group, the NATO nuclear planning group. So I just asked him sort of politely, well, what circumstances might you even think about using nuclear weapons? Well, he said, one of the things you had to remember is it's the possibility of the demonstration shot. So he said, if, for example, the Soviets had staged a surprise attack, a ground attack primarily of conventional troops and the rest, no nuclear things, and really overran the forward defenses in NATO, and things looked very serious. On that sort of occasion, then what we would do is to fire one or more, he said actually as many as 5 low-yield nuclear weapons high up, not to kill a load of people, but to demonstrate that we really mean it, really mean it. And I said, well, do you think it would work? Well, he said, well, it should work, and I'm sure the Soviets would sort of hold back. All I'm saying is that is the kind of thinking that you got then and could get again now. I mean, why on earth were tactical nuclear weapons, the smaller ones, even sent on any of the task force ships down to the Falklands Islands? One has to remember that things look very different from within a particular system. And I think that is something we have to remember from now on. So just a small added point there, but thanks again, that's a really good illustration of what's happening in the United States, and so often worrying for many of us, as I'm sure it is for you. So I think it's a natural follow-on from there is to ask Nick if he would talk more about the British dimension.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks to NIST for inviting me just to give you a bit of a overview of some recent work that speaks to this. I guess just to reiterate what Peter has said and others have said, that the idea that the UK can fairly quickly and easily reconstitute a nuclear-armed RAF, even with only 12 planes and using US bombs, is not right. It will be a very difficult and challenging task. And I say this because in a recent project on irreversibility in nuclear disarmament that was funded by FCDO, the Foreign Office, I explored what it would mean for a nuclear weapons complex to gradually over time come apart through a disarmament process, to the extent that the time and the cost and the value of reconstituting a nuclear weapons complex, putting it back together, would be a political non-starter. And the important thing to note from this work is the extent to which a nuclear weapons complex, even a fairly simple one like the UK's, simple compared to the Russian and US complexes, is a really complicated system of systems. And it's a system of systems that gets reproduced over time through use. So it takes an awful lot of organizational effort and money and knowledge and political will to do that, because a nuclear weapons complex won't sustain by itself. Decisions have got to be made, stuff has got to be funded, things tested, politicians enrolled, and all that sort of stuff. So as part of this work, I, together with one of the foreign officers now retired, but long-term, real deep experts on weapons of mass destruction issues, John Walker, we looked at the denuclearization of the RAF as a case study. Looked at how that process unfolded from the early 1990s over about a decade, and then asked the question, entirely hypothetically at the time, as to what it might mean to put something like this nuclear ecosystem, just the RAF bit, what it might mean to put that back together in the future. Little did we know a few months later that the Labour government was taking the first steps down this actual path. Anyway, our research shows that trying to safely, securely, credibly deploy a nuclear weapon on any sort of system is a really huge industry, and the challenges of doing this are routinely underestimated. Just looking at the RAF example, deploying nuclear weapons was a very complicated, very expensive process. And through the system of systems, even within just the RAF bit, there are increments of risk that build up to place a really significant burden on the armed service in question, on the Defence Ministry, on the state, and so on. And the RAF, well, it had this strategic nuclear role from 1956 until 1969, and then a tactical role until 1998, based around the family of WE-177 nuclear bombs. But generating and sustaining that capability required an awful lot of stuff to be put in place. And I'm just going to share my screen because I've got one or two slides that will just illustrate this. So this slide here, there's a link to the report here, and I'll upload these slides into the chat once I've finished. But this just shows what John and I mapped in terms of what the RAF nuclear ecosystem looked like. It entailed an awful lot. I mean, much more beyond, as Eliana hinted at, just the weapons and the aircraft. A huge ecosystem was necessary to enable the UK RAF to deploy nuclear weapons. We also then looked at the hypothetical of what it would mean to reverse this denuclearization to some degree. It's a truism to say that putting all of this back together is not technologically or financially impossible, right? With enough time and money and commitment. And this Labour government have chosen to re-nuclearize the RAF in the most minimal of ways, with 12 new aircraft and forward deployed US B-61 12 bombs. Just as an aside, a question just to pick up later for Eliana. My assumption has been that these weapons that might be assigned to UK aircraft would remain at Lakenheath, and that the planes would move to the weapons. But I don't know if that's true or not, because as you say, if the UK is going to deploy some of these at Marham, RAF Marham, that's an enormous undertaking to do that, an enormous, expensive undertaking. So this is what would really be required for the UK to re-nuclearize all these aspects. If it was going to do everything, new warhead, new delivery system, presumably a missile, new aircraft, and so on. So it's not doing those three big things, but it is going to have to do all the rest. Now, some of that will be undertaken by the US. My assumption is, as I put there, that the bombs in question will remain at Lakenheath. But if that's not the case, then this becomes a whole lot more complicated and more expensive. There are lots of challenges associated with this, and we were looking at what it would mean for the RAF to renuclearize indigenously, so developing potentially a new aircraft that would be nuclear capable with a UK or perhaps jointly with the US or France designed missile and a new warhead and so on. I mean, that the idea of the United Kingdom doing that really is for the birds. It would just be horrendously expensive, controversial, and very, very risky in terms of cost escalation and timeframes. But even just doing this really minimal sort of boutique version of renuclearizing the RAF, it's going to depend on regenerating a very broad, essential support structure, without which there is no operational nuclear weapons capability for the RAF, even one that's embedded in NATO systems and widespread essential American support. And it doesn't seem to reinforce the message from, or one of the messages from the report that Peter has so expertly put together. It doesn't seem that there's been any forethought here. I mean, this is political symbolism, really. There's a long history of understandings that forward deployed US nuclear weapons in NATO are there for, in many ways, symbolic purposes. And I think the Starmer-Healey decision to do this falls into that category. Just to reinforce this, I will finish with a quote, which, for my purposes, rather nicely illustrates it. This was a report published by the House of Commons Public Accounts Committee on October the 31st. It's a report on the UK's F-35 stealth fighter capability. And this is what it says. In June, the department announced it intends to procure these 12 aircraft to be training aircraft and capable of carrying nuclear weapons. But only now is the senior responsible owner within the Ministry of Defence. Only now is a senior responsible owner talking to other partner nations about what's required to deliver this. No estimates of what this might cost, and the department acknowledged that becoming certified for this mission will add new requirements, new training, personnel, possibly infrastructure, and the report goes on to cast a significant amount of doubt on the department's claims that this won't cost too much extra money. So I'll leave my remarks there and look forward to taking questions.
Thanks very much indeed, Nick. That was really good. Eliana, I don't know if I could just ask you, Nick was mentioning this question about where the bombs would actually be based. What would be your assessment? Are they more likely just to be at Lakenheath and the planes fly off there, pick them up and then go and sort of create havoc somewhere else, or what? Or do we just don't know about that at the moment?
Yeah, I think to that extent, I could only really speculate, and I think plans also tend to these days change. I would imagine that the vaults at Lakenheath that are being upgraded are assigned to the F-35s, and I can actually answer one of the questions here too, that was in the chat. They're assigned to the F-35s for that nuclear mission at Lakenheath, especially since those aircraft are US, whereas as Marham, those will be the UK aircraft, and I assume they will also have to upgrade those storage for warheads to be assigned to those UK aircraft specifically, since it's a little bit separate as a part of the NATO nuclear mission. That would be my speculation. And I'll jump also to this question about whether the F-15s at Lakenheath would be able to use nuclear weapons as well. So the F-15s at Lakenheath were originally the assigned nuclear capable delivery systems back in the early 2000s, when the US did have, its deployment of warheads at Lakenheath before they were removed. But since then, the vaults were placed in caretaker status, and it's been several decades since those F-15s were assigned a nuclear mission. So they have participated in exercises, I believe, but I don't think that they're certified anymore at this point, the ones at Lakenheath. So to my understanding, it will be the F-35s at Lakenheath that are certified to carry the new weapon in the nuclear mission. So I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thanks so much, Eliana. It's very helpful. Before we move on to the questions, I just want to reflect on a couple of things. I think what we've heard this afternoon from the presentations really gets us in the picture of what is actually happening. And of course, I really all praise to NIS for doing this so quickly, because I mean, we only learnt about this possibility beyond hints just a few months ago. And I think this is the start of something which we've all got to look at really pretty carefully. It's also worth remembering that, as Nick was implying, the whole thing is something of a mess at present. And we know so little of what is planned. But don't forget, this is in the context of an overall British nuclear posture, which is in pretty serious difficulty. We're seeing the Trident nuclear submarines going off on patrols for 5.5 months, which is unheard of in the distant past, because this puts huge strain on the crews. And this is because of all the problems of actually maintaining continuous at-sea deterrence with an aging fleet. But at the same time, they're looking to the new boats coming in as soon as possible. But there are very major problems there, particularly with reactor developments. So overall, it is a kind of smoke and mirrors. The whole of the British nuclear posture is really in something of a disarray. It's not surprising, I think, that we're actually seeing a situation in which secrecy is trying to be maintained even more so, but it's not going to happen that way. And I think this is why it is so important that so many people are well informed of what's really going on. Sorry, I'm almost getting on my soapbox there, but I think it's something which we have to recognize. So if we could go into the question and answer session. The first one I see is from Tom Cuthbert, who it was posed very early on in the session, great stuff there, about the accident records of the F-35A and B, and the way in which it seems to be a troubled system overall. I don't know whether Eliana, you could comment on this, or else Okopi or Nick. Any information on that you can give us?
Yeah, just to say, Paul, I mean, I wouldn't consider myself expert on the ins and outs of the F-35 program, but it has been a troubled program. I mean, it's incredibly expensive, and the UK has itself, as you well know, struggled to develop the squadrons in the time initially intended and within cost, the F-35B squadrons. Lots of decisions taken over the last 10 to 15 years to try and cut costs, which have ended up costing the RAF and Ministry of Defence a hell of a lot more money than it ever saved. But that's a slightly different issue to accidents and reliability. Though maybe I think, Peter, in the report, there's data in there on availability. And that's the question that's probably more central to the UK's purchase of 12 aircraft. The question of how many of those are likely to be available, given what we know about the availability record, including accidents and engineering problems with the program as a whole.
I think the one thing always to realize is that with all of these systems, you're dealing with what the equivalent are sort of racing thoroughbreds. They're very complex. All kinds of small things can go wrong, which develop very rapidly. And this is what makes the whole thing really very difficult to maintain. And you see this with warships, you see it with submarines, right across the board. You're not dealing with sort of run-of-the-mill things like sort of commercial jet airliners. These systems operate at a rather different level, and they cost a heck of a lot to maintain. I don't know, Peter, if you could comment, or indeed Eliana. I mean, I think we consider this sort of chat session, we're responding to questions. Please feel free, any of you, to call in terms of how to respond to the particular questions. Anything more on that, anybody?
I can say a couple of words, Paul.
Yeah, do please.
The thing about the F-35 aircraft is the computer and the electronics inside it are as important and as impressive as the airframe itself. You know, it's very much a kind of high-tech, high computer aircraft. precision engineered parts, but also a lot of complex software as well. So the software needs to be regularly updated. And if anything goes wrong with the electronics, that is a problem that makes the aircraft at risk. And a lot of the accidents that have happened with the F-35A have been linked to the in-flight electronics. Because the F-35 is such a high-profile aircraft, the accidents that it's had have been quite high in the sort of news perception. You know, whenever there's an accident with an F-35, it gets reported. Whether that means it's any less reliable than other military aircraft, you know, comparing the statistics with flight hours against accident rates, I don't know, I'm afraid.
Yes, on to Andy Sterling's question, comments on what a good talk from Peter. But essentially, what he's really asking is, why do NATO partners just almost minimize what Britain is doing and see it more as a performative thing? I think the answer to that is that, you know, what people know behind the scenes and what talk about behind the scenes is not the same as what they will say in public, because the needs of the whole group are really pretty important. But essentially, as far as the individual comments are concerned, you'll probably meet a lot of comments across the NATO nuclear people. Why on earth is the British doing this? It's only for their own ends and it's only a political thing. In fact, I think they would agree 100% with what Nick was saying to us. Barbara Coulson mentioned the thing about the B-61 and Lake and Heath and the rest. So I think hopefully we can move on that one, Barbara. And then we go on to, let's see, Tom Cuthbert, speculative cost of the F-35s. Can anything more be said on that at the moment, Eliana or Peter? I'm not sure.
I can say a few words, but Eliana, do you
Go
want
on,
to say something?
No, go ahead.
Sure. So, F-35 aircraft cost round about £60 million per aircraft, but that's only a very crude figure. You know, you can't easily say an aircraft costs this much, because when the Air Force buys the aircraft, it doesn't just buy the aeroplane, it buys all of the support packages and all of the software upgrades and all of the spare parts as well. So it's not a simple matter. And as well as that, the Ministry of Defence buys these aircraft in tranches. It buys a few aircraft at a time, and the different tranches are all costed by different amounts. So ballpark figure is about 60 million. Excuse me. The F-35A variant, which the government has said it's going to buy, which is the nuclear capable variant, that's going to be bought instead of some of the type that the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy have in service at the moment, the F-35B. Originally, the idea was just to buy F-35Bs because then you'd have one standard package, make things a lot easier for yourself. But no, we've decided we're going to get some F-35As as well. Now, for various reasons, the F-35A aircraft is about 15 to 20% cheaper than the F-35B. And the government are saying, oh, well, we'll be saving money from buying these aircraft. But it's important to remember that you're not really saving money. You're just buying something different. It's a different specification. It does different things. It has a different role. So to say that you're saving money from this is not really a sort of a fair representation of what's going on.
Fair enough. On to sorry, please, yeah.
Yeah, coming on that. This was certainly framed by the current government as a replacement, but it's a replacement only in this tranche. The government have said that it remains committed to procuring just as many F-35Bs as it originally intended to. So this isn't a cost saving in that sense. I mean, Peter's exactly right in terms of how the government framed it. But if the government sticks to its intention to procure as many of the F-35B fighter jets as it's intended to, then this will be these 12 F-35A jets to deploy with the B-6112 nuclear bombs will be an additional cost to the RAF. And I think there was a further question, maybe in the chat, maybe from Andy, about whether this is kind of a Starmer decision or more broadly from the defense establishment. I mean, it's a great question, and I don't know, but I suspect there will be many voices that are really concerned about this in the Air Force because of the potential for runaway costs, especially if there's as the Navy has seen, if the nuclear mission gets privileged above all else, then it becomes a gravity well sucking in resources from the armed service. So it wouldn't surprise me, and I'm just guessing, I don't know, it wouldn't surprise me if there's quite a bit of consternation and concern in the Air Force that it's been given this mission and then that will become more complicated, more expensive, and the RAF will have to find the money for that at the expense of other things that the RAF might wish to do.
It's worth adding that, when you talk to people in the Navy, you frequently find that there are plenty of people in the Royal Navy who would like to have seen the nuclear mission just gone. Because essentially, there aren't too many captaincies in the Polaris fleet. And people are much more interested in basically the skimmers, the surface warships. And you have so few of those around, partly thanks to the huge cost of the whole Trident program, that they lose out on that. But one other question here from Linda Pence-Gunter, which I think is worth looking at, about cost. Is there an opportunity to get this out to the wider public, given you're showing that all this money is going to be spent on something that sounds like it's not even feasible? Surely that could be a big political misstep for Labour, given all their cuts to social needs. If I'm right, Linda, you actually write fairly often for the Morning Star. And I would say that the reality is that getting this kind of material into the print media in Britain is really pretty difficult. Apart from the Guardian and certainly the Morning Star, it's really difficult to get it in. And I think, any way that you yourself could help would be good on this. I could certainly see a good article on this for the Morning Star will be picked up very quickly and passed around a lot. Because although it's a very limited circulation newspaper, it has a wider reach than people realize. And it's a good place to get this sort of story out. And then maybe some of the more lightweight papers would actually pick up on this. But that's a personal view. Let's just go on. Any truth that these F-35As may, hang on a sec, may replace some of the F-35Bs? I think we talked about that, haven't we, Nick? Incidentally, can I ask all of the panelists, just feel free to keep unmuted, because we can have this as more of a discussion. If anybody wants to chip in on any point, please do that. I know that this is not so easy for people listening, but believe me, this is a new subject, and I suspect we're going to have further webinars on this, in which, it'll be much easier to have wider discussions among a group of people. But since we've got these people together now, this is why I think it's worth concentrating in this way. Peter looks actually and adds also, how do we reach a wider audience rather than just talking to each other in our anti-nuclear bubble silo? That again, people might want to reflect on this. Any comments on that, in fact, first, before we go on?
Just a
Yeah,
comment.
sure. I can. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Eliana. Go ahead.
No, that's fine. I can just speak a little bit to this. I think it was a question that came up a few times. Just I think it goes to show how important this work is that you all are doing, but also the work of other organizations and advocacy, where it's really important to be able to take this maybe more complex information that you get through digging through data and archives and budget documents and be able to distill it down in a way that makes sense to people and that translates to people's maybe like everyday understanding. So the idea of having nuclear weapons in your backyard, I think, is a very maybe scary way to communicate that how much of a reality this is. When it comes to budgets too, and how expensive these programs are, that's also always a great way to help people really understand the extent to which this is a commitment and how much it will affect, maybe not your daily life, but affect how things are, or whether or not the UK will be, I mean, they're already paying for these aircraft, but presumably the upgrades themselves, and there's going to be so much more that has to be spent on that infrastructure. So the messaging around that, I think, can be very attainable for people. And something that we like to do as well is graphics and satellite imagery, which I think can communicate a big picture all in one piece. You can tell a story with this photo. So that's something that I think we try to do as well, where you can share that around. You can put that in a quick social media post in a way that maybe might be a little bit more accessible for people. But yeah, I definitely think that the more work that we can do on this issue, the more engagement that we can have with other people and make that connection for how it will impact them, then the more awareness and debate that we'll be able to have on these issues.
Great, thanks very much. Just
Oh,
to
I'm
point
sorry.
out that,
I'm
go on,
sorry.
please. Go on, Peter.
Sorry.
Go on, Okopi,
Uh,
please.
I just wanted to add just a quick appreciation for the work that Eliana Johns and also as well people like what the people in Nukewatch do, because right now information about the UK's nuclear weapon system, in contrast to the US, is becoming increasingly secretive, is becoming increasingly opaque. And as several people here likely know, the UK has a policy of neither confirming nor denying the presence of nuclear weapons on its soil. So you can't just ask them, is there a B6112 in the UK? They'll never tell you per UK policy. So this information is often discovered through the use of satellite imagery and open source intelligence, the likes of which is provided by the Federation of American Scientists and as well as Nukewatch. So I just wanted to give a quick just give these organizations credit of the enormously important work that they're doing.
Just to note that keep an eye on chat, because Eliana's got a link to one of her publications, a highly relevant one, and I've also put in a link, or rather Trish has put in a link to a thing I did for Declassified a while ago, which is basically about the sort of the more hidden history of British nuclear weapons in the more distant past, when we were pretty significant in terms of the number of different systems we had. Now, I've got a problem with my own machine. Yes, Jane Talent. Is this plan to have another nuclear platform in the UK a political move related to the declared intent of, hang on a sec, it's gone, of an independent Scotland to be nuclear free and make Trident submarines and their successors homeless? That's an interesting one. Peter or Nick, have you got any answers to that one?
It's an interesting question. Clearly, there are problems with the Trident program. It'll be another perhaps 10 years before the new submarines come into service, and the Ministry of Defence are having real problems in keeping the existing submarines going. So you could look at this in two ways. You could look at this as, well, maybe this is one way of kind of sugaring the pill. We think we might not be able to keep the existing submarines in service, but we'll be able to reassure the public that they're quite safe because we have these other nuclear systems, these nuclear armed aircraft to look after you while the submarines are not in service. I think you can see the flaws in that argument on a number of levels, but it is possible. And again, it is possibly putting the spotlight away from Scotland and possibly responding to nationalist critiques. Well, how come we've got all of the nuclear weapons up here in Scotland and we have to take all the risks, and there's nothing down in England? So, Jane, yeah, I think that's a very interesting question.
Yeah. Quick note from Tom Cuthbert, worth a comment on. Is this F-35 nuclear posture from the UK intended to impress the US or the Russians? Any comments on that?
Yes, I'll say maybe a little bit of a mix of both. There's I'm sure an element here where the communicated message is unity with increased partnership with the US, but as well as NATO, and increased unity in response to perceived the security environment, whether that's Russia or otherwise. But I think there's definitely messaging that's meant to be communicated to Russia, but also partnership with the US needs to remain strong, and the UK also partners in different areas with France. So I think this is just one added element of communicating that, like that political signaling about strength and willingness, credibility to respond or to threaten nuclear use. And I think that's also evident in the type of system that they chose. So the F-35s, and I imagine there's a number of reasons for that. One, there's existing relationships where the U.S. has supplied these weapons, so it's already an existing kind of arrangement. It'll likely, it'll probably be cheaper for the UK to stand up this kind of mission versus building another submarine base, right? So there are maybe some trade-offs there. So I think there's probably a few number of reasons that do seem to come back to political messaging and signaling to a number of different actors.
Great, thanks very much. I noticed a note from Steve Barwick about a launch of another report from an independent charity, that's the Nuclear Education Trust, which is on the same sort of theme as this. It's in a couple of weeks' time on the 25th of November. And just check that out on Q&As. Steve has given his email address if you want to contact him. I see Dan Plesh wants to come in. I'll just take a couple of more questions, and then Dan, if you can join us, but just bear with me a little bit as we've got quite a lot that's already on the plate, but there should be time for yours as well. Hugh Hubbard, recently a Vanguard sub returned after a 203-day patrol. The risk of accident and losing a sub is rising. Can you speculate on the consequences? And just follow that on with one just after, which I wanted to make sure many of you know that since he retired as defense correspondent, security correspondent of The Guardian, Richard Norton-Taylor has been doing some very interesting stuff for Declassified UK. And he comments here, I'm astonished by how few, including MPs, are concerned about these developments. Even more astonished given the increased use and viability of cheap hybrid threats and the vulnerability of home defense. How can more people be alerted to the dangers and expense? Well, that's a huge issue, and I think it's one of the ones that is behind us, beside us all the time. But just go back to Hugh. I don't know whether, Peter, you could comment, or any of our contributors can comment to that particular one, on this whole business about what actually happens if we have a major problem with one of the submarines.
So if a Trident submarine was launched at sea, that would be a national tragedy. No doubt about that. There would be more than 100 seafarers losing their lives. A submarine worth hundreds of millions of pounds would have sunk, as well as, the possible risks. Well, what's happened to it? Was it sunk deliberately by the Russians? It would be an incredibly tragic and incredibly dangerous moment if that was ever to happen. So, let's, please hope to God that never does happen. Clearly, there are problems with the Navy's Trident submarines, but on the other hand, the Navy does have safety regulators. Whether or not the regulations on safety are being pushed to allow submarines to go to sea when they shouldn't, we just don't know. This issue arose in the 2000s when there were problems with reactor cracking, and submarines were all of the sort of hunter-killer, the non-nuclear armed submarines were kind of brought back to port. But at the same time, the nuclear armed submarines, the Vanguard class submarines, remained at sea. And we were told, well, this is because they've got a different type of reactor. Again, we'll never know how true that was and how much of a risk there was. But although I don't think the risks of a submarine being lost at sea are huge, clearly the older and the poorer state of repair they're in, the more they increase, and the more stress and strain is on the crew, then again, the risks increase.
Yeah, and just to add onto that just a little bit, when you have longer turns patrols of these submarines, that means that they likely need to go through longer maintenance periods, which means that the other submarines on patrol will be out at sea long. So it's really like a cumulative impact, as Peter mentioned, on service members themselves, but also just on the strain that it puts on the infrastructure and the functioning of the submarines and the rotation that they'll be be on patrol. So just to add that little bit as well.
Paul, could I just add something on that too?
Yeah.
I mean, the experience which I would put some money on, I'm not sure that we'll see again, is with the transition from the old Resolution class submarines carrying the Polaris missile to the current Vanguard fleets carrying the Trident missile. And the Navy had to limp along doing back-to-back patrols for about 2 years during that transition because the older Resolution boats were just in dock under repair all the time. HMS Vanguard is looking pretty crusty. The first of class of the current fleet of submarines. We haven't been given an in-service date for the new Dreadnought class. It's just early 2030, so that's a bit of a movable feast, but that's still some time away. So I would imagine there's a pretty good chance that HMS Vanguard or maybe one of the other Vanguard class submarines will be largely out of commission. It'll be tied up in repairs for much of the end of its service life, and the Navy will have to try and continue this continuous at sea deterrence posture with 3 submarines, maybe even 2, which will be incredibly challenging for the Navy. And yet everything hinges politically on the totemic significance of having continuous at sea deterrence. And if that falls by the wayside, I would imagine there are many in the nuclear enterprise in the UK that would see that as potentially a pulling of the rug out from under the nuclear mission in the UK.
And I mean, that's how serious this whole issue is becoming. I should add, I think I'm right, Peter, that with all the hunter-killer submarines out of action for a while, the SSN, what people don't realize is that the idea that a missile submarine goes to sea, disappears, and that's it. It's true in a way, but normally there is a system in which is called deterrent support, where there is normally an SSN available from the direction of the threat, so to speak. So if you could imagine a missile submarine in the Northeast Atlantic, you would normally have a hunter-killer submarine well to the northeast. And I think this is an indication of how tricky things are. Right, let me see what we got now. Dan Plesh, is it possible for Dan to come in, Trish, and deliver his comments orally?
Okay, so first of all, if I think there is provision in Project 25 for upgrading NATO dual-capable aircraft. That would seem to me to be a potential driver behind this. Secondly, the debates in NATO, some of the East Europeans, the Poles are very keen on taking these sorts of roles. So my analysis would be that Project 25 indicates that this may well have been an offer that Starmer NATO couldn't refuse, and that better Britain than Poland from some analysis. I also think in terms of discussion of these bases, it's much better to talk about them in Suffolk. People know where Suffolk is. They don't know where these rather cuddly names bases are. I also think we should, having been in Pugwash and reminded about nuclear winter, we should think about these exercises about triggering nuclear winter. And lastly, there's a colleague at King's who is producing a slew of documents about NATO nuclear planning exercises in the 1980s. And these are very salutary. They indicate that heads of state, head of government, were directly involved in making recommendations on nuclear use, and presumably steadfast noon includes principles, Secretary of State, Prime Minister, and we should focus on that, I think, in the next round of steadfast noon. I hope some of that was comprehensible.
Yes, that's very helpful, Dan, and it takes us into a further dimension. I'll be coming back time and time again that the whole issue of nuclear discussions and nuclear controversies is coming back to the fore in ways which many of us didn't expect. And I think we had to be ready for that, which again is why I think that this sort of session is going to be so important at this stage. Incidentally, we've had 80 or 90 people in this afternoon, which is a lot more than you normally get. It's an indication, I think, of an interest suddenly developing. People are waking up to the fact that it's not so much a brave new world, but an unbrave old world we seem to be moving back to, at least in the relation to the nuclear side.
Yes, I don't think, if I might, I don't think that we should just think about this as British. I don't think
Yes,
the Starmer would have thought of this on his own and company. I think driven by, as I say, Project 25, the Eurobomb discussions, all of these will have impinged on a British, somewhat symbolic decision, British decision on this. But as I say, I think framing in terms of Suffolk and nuclear winter is a way of bringing it to a broader public attention. Oh, unless we forget, perhaps you might make some arms control proposals.
Yes, I mean, I think this is part of the whole thing that we have to appreciate, that there are new generations of people for whom the Cold War is unknown. And a lot of the things that, some of the older lags like me around can remember, nuclear winter and all the rest, has to be rebroadcast in a way, and remind people of what we come through. And also always the extraordinary range of near misses and dangerous crises that we've had in the past. Because essentially it makes it much more likely that people will take on frankly, the stupidity of what is going on. And that, it seems to me, is going to be hugely important.
Congratulations to everybody associated with this study.
Yes, I would agree very much. We're coming almost to the end of time. We were originally due to end at 6:15. We're just about coming up to that. What I'd like to do, if I may, just give a quick notice, if I could ask Okopi, Peter, Eliana, and Nick for some final comments. And then Okopi, would you like to then draw it to a close at the end? And I'll make a few comments as well. So yes, let's do it that way. If we start with Eliana, Nick, Peter, and myself, and then Okopi, if you could actually just sort of draw it all to a close, I think that would be good. So basically, Eliana, would you like to start? Any final comments reflecting on what we've heard today?
Sure. Yeah, I guess I'll just say it's, again, really great to be a part of a group of folks who are really interested in and keen on keeping tabs on these programs. I think it's more important now more than ever that we have really great communities of practice and people who are promoting transparency in these issue areas, especially as we see these things changing really rapidly. So thank you again for the opportunity to join.
Nick?
Yeah, thanks everybody. I guess my parting comment would be just to note that the Strategic Defence Review under this government and its energy review really signal a very significant re-nuclearization of the British state, both in civil and military terms. And I know there's been some questions from Andy Sterling. Andy and his colleague Paul Johnson have done some fantastic work really exposing the relationship between the sort of the deep-rooted relationship in the UK between the civil and the military nuclear. But this is just to put this in context, when we're talking about significant investment in small modular reactors with Rolls-Royce from the government and re-nuclearizing the RAF, we're talking broadly about the same thing, a re-nuclearization of the British state. And that's something I don't think quite gets enough attention.
Yeah. Peter?
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you to everybody for all of your sage comments and your really inquisitive questions. I just want to say, although nuclear weapons are really highly valued and prized by the British elite, it has always been very difficult for the UK to maintain its nuclear weapons capability. It's at the absolute margins of UK technical and engineering capability. It's always been something that the UK has struggled with, even from the earliest days of the V-bomber program back in the 1950s, if you look through the official histories. The government's answer to that has always been to throw money at the problem, but I think we're reaching the stage now where throwing money isn't working. The government have been throwing as much money as they can to try to keep Trident submarines at sea. Clearly, it's still going to be a problem. And throwing money, even if you increase money in line with NATO's incredibly high targets for military spending, is not going to help get nuclear-armed jets into bases in East Anglia. The Americans at Lakenheath have been undergoing a certification program to get that base ready for nuclear weapons, and that process has taken years and is still ongoing in some ways, we think. And that's for an American base which has had nuclear weapons before. So just think how big the challenge is for the Royal Air Force. You know, the government needs to understand it's entering unknown territory, and when you enter unknown territory, you face risks.
I notice in the chat that Stuart Parkinson from Scientists for Global Responsibility has put in a very useful link to the issue of UK nuclear weapons and nuclear winter. So just check that out and make a note of that. Overall, I think, let me comment as sort of person not completely involved, and that is to thank NIS for doing this. In particular, I know Okopi is going to deliver the final message, but from my perspective, having an organization like this in conjunction, obviously with Nukewatch on this occasion, I think it's been really useful, and I suspect there's going to be a lot more going on about this. I notice in the chat there are comments about different demonstrations already being planned for the new year, which go back particularly to what's going to happen at Marham. And that's an indication, I think, of people beginning to realize what we're about here. So, Okopi, could I ask you now to sort of bring it all to a close?
Yes, I want to say thank you to all our panelists, as well as you, the moderator, Paul, for your contributions today. They've all been very interesting, very unique, and consistent with our name as a nuclear information service. I want to say that information is power, and we hope that the information provided in this report can be used as leverage by the various organizations and individuals who have been in this chat to perhaps push for a better direction that you would like to see the UK go down to, away from this nuclear path, like which Nick Ritchie warned about. And we also want to say that we at NIS are very open to feedback. So if you have any feedback about this presentation, please feel free to provide to us afterwards. And we also like to say thank you to the audience for taking your time to come today, and also for providing some very interesting, thought-provoking questions. I'm going to be thinking about some of these for quite a while, and even going to be investigating them further. So I think on that note, we hope we hope to see you again for any future events that we host at NIS, as well as we also hope to see you attend some of the other events that have been suggested here, so that we can keep this conversation going. So on that note, that's it. Thank you very much.
Bye, everybody.